and are around our ability to kind of balance the approach of these two factors of who we are as people, our material and spiritual aspects of ourselves. And I think what's interesting is, when I was talking to Daniel about redefining success, understanding the unity of our spiritual and material well-being, I think it's just an interesting paradigm shift to identify how much the spiritual portion of who we are combined with what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. Really, there needs to be a harmony between the two. And I think when there's not a harmony, then that's where there's a dissonance, that's where there could be a concern, that's where we become quite myopic. I think we have maybe 3 or 4 different types of lives. We have our work life, we have our family life, we have our faith, we have something else, and that becomes difficult to manage. And I think the true approach of success, at least for myself and my own experience, is that combining it and integrating it into everything else makes an experience much more meaningful. And one of the questions that I had thought about with respect to this is, of course, understanding what that spirituality means. For some people, it may mean a faith. For some other people, it may mean their moral compass. For others, it could be this ephemeral state of balance. It could be a number of different things. I don't think there needs to be a definition, but I think it is related to an inner voice. And one of the things that I think is really helpful is to understand what that inner voice is and allow for that to prosper and allow for that to be cultivated. And one of the articles I found in preparing for this discussion was, how do you develop an inner voice if you're not familiar with it? Because some of us may not be familiar with our inner voice, and some of us may not be used to bringing up this capacity in our other lines of work or lines of focus. So I thought it was a nice guideline. I found this really interesting guide point, which gave 6 steps to talk through in making the inner voice more prominent. And it was simply, number 1, being more open and willing and welcoming yourself as your own wise counsel. And I think this is interesting. I was having a conversation today with someone who was talking to their executive coach about what are and who are the most important roles that they play. And they wrote down in order of importance. So they may have had son, friend, brother, leader, manager. And the person asked, you're missing the most important. Where's your own advocate for yourself? Where's your own expert? And I thought that was just an interesting parallel, that I think we think about so many external influences, but we don't always think about our own capacities to guide ourselves. So that's one thing. To be open is one of the steps. And being welcome to that. The second one is paying attention. So in looking at paying attention to our inner voice, the advice was describing that when we have a phone call, when we're talking to a friend, when we're listening about something, what is our sense? Where do we feel very confirmed? And where does that confirmation come from? And rather than it only being intellectual or birational, is there a way that you can kind of sense your own thought process below it? And that was, again, another interesting step around, paying attention and feeling good about something, and that those are indicators of your inner voice. Another one is slowing down. So the article that I read talked about how our ego is often the loudest and the first to speak to us about our preferences and how we go about things and our reactions to things. But if we slow down a bit, maybe there's something below the surface that we can detect. I think ideally we may want to call that our higher nature, our spiritual side, but that's another component that can lead us to really find out what that inner voice is about. And then another one is practice. How do you practice on hearing your inner voice? And this was interesting because I think that muscle memory is something around, people may understand what meditation is, to close down everything and to be able to meditate. They may use prayers. But another possibility, if you're not familiar with it, is pondering on pictures. When someone rings you, actually assume who will call you and actually guess, listening to your inner voice. And it's so funny because I was on an urgent call about something and I saw a call come from France and I thought, oh no, I think this has to do with the webinar. Oh my God. And so then I knew, right? My inner voice kind of spoke to me and I was like, oh. And then I frantically was writing to Daniel. I apologize for the timing. But really, you know, having that ability to practice your intuition and practice your inner voice on things that are maybe not as high stake. Right? Because you develop that muscle, you develop that capability, and then when you've gotten to know it, the last step is really important, and that's trust. Trust in the decision that your intuition or inner voice has. And I know for my internal work life, one of the things that I've really relied on many times is where there's a real crisis or compliance issue or something that has a very severe stake, I tend to try to step back and hear what my inner gut is saying, not my legal side, but my inner gut says about what's the right choice, right? Because if you align what you're saying with the more in-depth perspective that you feel right about, I think it changes things. And not only does it change things for yourself, but it changes things for people around you. Because when you're speaking from your heart, and you're speaking from your spirit, it's a completely different reaction, right? Because you're all in. And I believe very strongly that other people's inner voices will resonate with that, right? So there's a power in being able to really speak from within once you've trusted it, and being able to comprise your decisions or to be able to align your decisions with it, and then to communicate it with others. So that's just something that is an interesting experiment and something that is, I think, could be really meaningful for people. And I just want to break for a second to see if people resonate with that, if that feels like a decent strategy, if that feels maybe that it's missing a couple steps. Anyone want to offer their feedback? Because I'd love to hear what others are thinking.
I was thinking about it because I'm taking an online course as well at the moment called Cultivating Transformative Leadership. And in these earlier units, they started talking about mental models. So mental models we each have as individuals, which sort of resonates with Nishat was saying about our inner voice, our inner self, and how we think about things. And I was also thinking that mental models, of course, if they get stuck in our mind and we don't consciously start to question whether we need to make some changes or innovations, then we are, in a sense, prejudiced. And that's a lot of the things that we see in the world today that prevents us from having success as well. So they talk about mental models as individuals, which in turn also then interact with mental models in society. So really enjoy the idea that we really have to be far more conscious of our inner voices, and to sort of respond to it with gut feeling.
I like to add to this. I'm absolutely with you what you said, because if the people separate the I from the we, and the I from the was, the us, people talk a lot about oneness and doing things collective and accessing collective intelligence, all these buzzwords in business, but the how-to is missing because they're still separating themselves. It doesn't have anything to do with your, what phase you follow. If you allow your soul to impact your mind, then we are on a different page together. And the other thing is, currently there is a tendency in organizations who go through a lot of transformation, meaning they have to get rid of a couple of people, and they mix it all and they just set it up in a new way of making more money. For the benefit of some, but for the disadvantage of a lot of people. But I run a course that, find your calling or find your vocation. This is, sorry to say that it's very popular right now. In the end, it's about being whole and being accepted in, as a whole at work.
It's interesting that the part that you bring up about this, about, what is our true calling? And I find that service to others is a large component of what our calling is. And there's a beautiful quote. There's two quotes actually that relate to this. And this kind of goes to the question of factors that develop a coherence between who we are spiritually and who we are materially. And Tagore, he said this beautiful quote that man's abiding happiness is not in getting anything, but in giving himself up to what is greater than himself, to ideas which are larger than his individual life, the idea of his country, of humanity, of God. And of course, there's another quote by Baha'u'llah that says, all men have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. And I think in like manner, when we look at when we look at what of our purpose is, I think ultimately people's success, people's happiness is really embedded in the idea that we actually do have to be in service to others. And we actually do have to think about how is this good on the larger context. And maybe in the specific tasks that you're doing at your work, it may not feel like you're in service to humanity, but it can be. Right? I think it can be. I know I've tried to look at one day when I was working at an insurance company as counsel. Wow, that was a little bit harder to do, to try to think about how I could be in service to others, but then realizing the impact of doing my role correctly and how it fit as a cog in a greater wheel. Now at TED, it's a very much more direct feeling because of the mission of what TED is doing. So that in a way is easier for me to see the impact directly. But I think everyone has that ability to kind of scale from themselves to really understand what service is. And what's really interesting is in certain perspectives, there is this view that in fact, in the Baha'i faith anyway, there's this idea that work is actually worship. That's equivalent to prayer when it's done in the service of humanity. So that's a really interesting thought process, right? To think about, how can our work be elevated? How can our work be more greater? How can we reach out to our calling and really feel what our calling is? And if we believe that our calling is being in service to others, something outside of ourselves, that's a really interesting exercise to take and probably would lead to different outcomes in our daily work than what we may feel in completing our tasks.
I've also had a lot of luck starting with people's own cynicism and bitterness. I mean, those are things that people identify with, and they feel internally. And so one of the things about cynicism is just a cynic is a passionate person who doesn't want to be disappointed again. And so an interesting thing from an organizational point of view, if I take someone who's cynical way out to here, I know the flip side of it is if they can re-engage, their passion's going to be way over here. And those are equal in magnitude. There's just what's the sign, plus or negative. And then comes up the question of, well, why are you cynical? And so there's this little process to get into that says when someone sees something that's hypocritical, it feels false, it feels fake. People typically get angry, then they get cynical, then they get bitter. And the question then is if you can unpack that and work to it and say, well, what's that conversation? What's actually driving that? You can usually get to a couple things that really have this engaging conversation. And if you look at economics, for example, the smallest element in economics, classical economics, is homo economicus, economic man, which misses half the population by gender, and nobody's really economic anyway. So there's no reality in that. They just came up with that to make the math work. And so a lot of the things about psychology, about business, about economics that people feel uncomfortable with are because it missed we. Oxytocin is sort of the love or bonding hormone, and it's got this multiplier on it from estrogen. So estrogen increases the effect of oxytocin, testosterone reduces the effect of oxytocin. So men are more likely to have a lower bonding response, women are more likely to have a greater one. And so this is one of those things, if you have a science developed by men who aren't necessarily going to have the same degree of bonding, there will be more of that egotistical, competitive, fight or flight response cooked into it, because that's the way the brain works. Now, if some of these things were to be rediscovered, in effect, by someone who was starting with a weak consciousness, you would end up with a different economics, a different psychology that would be equally valid, if not more so. And one example from business is if you look at the financial results of companies that have mixed gender boards, they outperform financial results of male-only boards. And so weak consciousness in an organization beats I consciousness, even if it's collective. Do you want to be in this very competitive organization where you feel like you're not being true to yourself, or you're looking for something where you can express, where it's healthier to express we?
Well, one of the other quotes that I had thought of for this was, how are you going to integrate that we part into your daily work? And Dr. Brene Brown is fantastic at kind of really pinpointing this in her TED Talk and others, but she says that vulnerability is the core, the heart, and the center of meaningful human experiences, right? So vulnerability really means that you're not just thinking on that higher level, competitive kind of approach, but you're actually going within and you're acting authentic and you're providing people that inner part. And I think the we is actually part of that, because you're opening up from I to we. So you're expanding that. And to truly do that in a way that's meaningful probably requires vulnerability, which is hard to do for a lot of people. It's not common to integrate that, but I think that's part of the risk, part of the overall, again, redefining success, right? That's the whole core. How do we redefine it? You have to break the old structures to get into a redefinition, right? Just curious if the people on the call have had challenges in integrating their own sense of we or vulnerability or spiritual side into their work, if that's been challenging, maybe because of cynicism, or maybe because of the workplace, maybe because of a disruptive culture. What are the lessons learned that we can gain from each other? Because I think I've had situations where I've even had to leave a job because being ethical was problematic. And this was a law firm in Holland, of all things. Shocking to me, because I did not think the Dutch would be like that. I figured that would be left for the Americans. But unfortunately, the firm I worked for was just different. And, being ethical meant to bill appropriately and truthfully. And that was a problem. So I wasn't going to work there anymore. And I find it really challenging to have that dichotomy where sometimes you find your work is not where your inner voice is calling you to be, or you feel there's a dissonance. And I think that's probably the hardest situation to get in, because you're not sure if the second, third, fourth opportunity is going to open itself up, because I think that is an important lesson to be learned. And I've had situations where it went horribly wrong and I realized I had to leave, and then of course I found a different opportunity. And at other times it got me advanced and promoted in the corporation. And I remember when I had to deal with something at a Fortune 100 company that I was working for, we had a compliance issue that a lot of people didn't want to face. They wanted to put a Band-Aid response to it. And there was some very deep internal fissures that happened, which we had to address. But it was step on people's toes. It would be difficult. It would be messy. But we ended up changing what we did. And as a result of it, I thought I would be facing either a termination because it was too much, or something else. And the something else happened. And I remember many of my colleagues asking, oh, you must be very aggressive about your ambition. Can you tell me what you did so I can do the same thing? And it was so off-putting, because I was like, ew, I didn't want this. But because of the situations that we got ourselves into, I ended up being promoted a couple of times because of this, which was fascinating, but it had nothing to do with my ambition at all. It was just being true to really my inner voice and saying, no, there's a problem here. You need to do it this way, or please let's look at and explore a different way, because this other thing is going to land us into serious issues. So it's something that's really difficult, but I think if we go on the route of making our inner voice compatible with our work self, I think the thing that will happen is with any major change, and with really being authentic, we're going to run into a few barriers along the way. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be like, and not everyone's going to be like, yay, your inner voice, I want to get to know that part. They may be a little bit offish, they may be not really interested in it. So how does one go about that? And how does one deal with that?
Your comments just now resonate with me a great deal. What I find often is that the definition of we changes. When I introduce something into a work group or some other kind of an association, a collective project, a collective work, it's always interesting to observe the reaction. Is this part of the we as we define it? Or is this some other definition of we that we're really not interested in? Then, of course, I have the choice to either push for adding to that definition of who are we as a collective, or to disengage. And like you, I have done both with a variety of results, including very positive results, and I have also done that with less than positive results. And so clearly many groups who claim to be interested in the collective function really aren't, and they're really not interested in expanding their definition of what we really means.
It really separates also what words mean versus actions, right? Because
Yes.
many people think they understand it, and I love when companies have an inclusive diversity culture. They want to have it. They don't understand exactly what that actually means. For the most part, the level of integration of our spiritual side to our material. One of the things I went to a couple weeks ago, I went to a law school and spoke to third-year law students who were interested in starting their career. And one of the things I said to them was, at this point, before you start your career, please take time to really reflect on who you are. What are you really looking for? What is your true calling? What is your view on what you want to do here? And I said to them, because rarely do they have an opportunity to really reflect with that level of conscious exercise. I think before we get onto a career, before we're there, I think it gives us an opportunity to really ponder it. But a lot of people in education are not taught to think about that part of ourselves, right? It's a muscle that's not practiced, that's not engaged. We have physical education every day of our lives, but no spiritual education, no, faith-based understanding of who we are as human beings on this planet Earth, and how do we share our planet with others, and how do we contribute to the greater good. We don't get that training, so I think it makes it harder to develop it on our own, but I do think there are resources available, and I think that if anyone has ever read The Alchemist by Pablo Coelho, it is an extraordinary story and symbolic, I think, framework for understanding what it means to rely on our own inner voice, and how when we do so, not only do things happen better, but the universe works in your favor. So that's a beautiful level of really redefining success, right? When the universe works with you. I don't think you could have a more global reframe, but I think that happens. I really do think that happens, that doors open, the right voice comes, the right advice opens up, the mentor says something to you that clicks. When it is aligned to your own inner voice, those things actually take that path. when you take something from your ego, when you go for your lower nature, when you do something just for profit or for the wrong we, let's say you're only investors or only your, your quarterly numbers that you're really concerned about, it's a different voice that's talking at that moment, and maybe more ego, right? Maybe more I, certainly not as much as a we. And I think that that's interesting when you look at companies that stretch into becoming a B Corp, right? They're starting to really stretch into the definition of we and learning how to make a stakeholder the we. And I think that's along the lines of what a new success looks like. Exactly. It is the offices, actually. You can see while I'm walking towards this, and I'm going into my conference room. One second. One of the things that we do during contract negotiations, it's funny, I've been working in this legal field for about 20 years, and one of the things that I like to do is bring it down to the most simplistic principles. What are we really doing, and does it make a lot of sense? And taking away the legalese, taking away the high complex terms, taking away all of that, and say what we're doing, does it sound right? And ultimately, if it doesn't sound right, there's an opening for the other side to understand your perspective. And it goes back to that why. Why are we doing it this way? And I think the groupthink that happens in our society is one of the driving factors of, they're doing it because, they just announced to the quarterly investors this thing. We have to do the same thing. No, now everyone has to do it with this crazy frenetic view. One of the things I used to challenge often in corporate environments is the M&A process. Because when you start acquiring a company, typically the process around that is very, very fast. Don't have a lot of time to reflect. You're asking people to work overnight for weeks at an end. There's a lot of high stakes in the room, and there's this promise that the return on investment is huge. Typically, it never actually happens that way, right? In reality, return of investment is probably a third of what you expect, but everyone wants to believe in the disbelief for that short amount of time and engage in that level of pressure. For what? So I remember sometimes speaking to the teams and saying, I had this partner of a law firm call me to talk about a red flag in an agreement. And I said, it's 11 o'clock at night on a Saturday. Why are you calling me? Why are you charging me $800 an hour for this when it's really an issue we can deal with in a couple of days? But because everyone was so high strung, and working with this group dynamic of rush, you're not even able to be critical about analyzing things. And I think that's such an important key. There's this concept of justice. What is true justice? It's really seeing with your own eyes and not with the eyes of another, and understanding that being a critical thinker is so necessary, and to be able to review issues on your own without necessarily everyone else weighing in and saying one is right, one is wrong, and allowing that inner voice to actually give an answer. It's a very interesting replacement for just going with the flow with what everyone else is doing. And I think, like in the company standards, when you have issues, and I've met with C-suite personnel often, and when we break it down to the simplistic, what are we really doing here? And is this, for example, fair to the consumers? Is the investment appropriate? Are the risks okay? What do we do about this crisis? And you break it down to the most simplistic principles, people resonate with that because it leaves the artifice on the side. And I think that's when their gut feeling says, yeah, you're making sense. Let's do what you just said. Rather than follow everything else, right? So it's an interesting paradigm shift.
Part of the problem is, in a sense, the legal structure, the legal foundation of the modern corporation in many places. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the charter itself to which the managers are sort of bound, is to meet the needs of the shareholders. And they're not given much room for maneuver. I mean, I've met business people who said they would like to do more, but they'd get fired because they're not respecting the legal charter of the corporation if they put other values first. So it's only partly a question of individual morality or values, but people often are trapped within a system, and the system itself corrupts them and forces them to go in directions that they feel uncomfortable with. But that means much more fundamental change. It's not just changing some people, it's changing the very structure of business as it's been defined, at least in the Western world. We make all this room to do the wrong things, and make it much more difficult to do the right things. So that's sometimes, if you're trapped in such a situation, the only option is to leave it, because you cannot by yourself necessarily transform the legal charter of the corporation.
Nishat, actually, I have a question connected to that, because, for example, just yesterday in the news, Italy Coffee just changed its statutes to become a benefit corporation. So they had to change the statutes, which obviously implied that they're no longer slaves to the shareholder, but instead to a higher purpose. And I wonder, from your experience, because you do a lot of that, does the statute really change then the dynamic of the company, the focus?
It's an interesting question, because on this, while you were speaking, Arnold, one of the things I was thinking about is Steve Jobs, because I think he's a quintessential example of a pioneer who knew more about, I think, the shareholders and his customers before the customers did. And so if you can pioneer and be inventive on that level, why can't you be a pioneer and inventive on what truly helps your stakeholders? Your stakeholders are your employees, your shareholders, your management, the company. And true benefits arise from that, like the company Chobani, for example. There was a TED Talk given by the CEO of Chobani, who cares deeply about the workers, so much so that he does profit sharing, he does education provisions, he does a whole number of things, and has really turned what running a company on its head because of the way he's adapted his policies. And I think that then also becomes a more beneficial, more profitable company, just like more women on boards makes for more profitable companies, more diversity makes for more profitable companies. So I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding that whilst legal charters provide a structure that people are used to, I think we could pioneer within that, and then also look to both redefine what we mean by when we talk about our shareholders, and also redefine what the benefit to them is. Is it just monetary? Or is it actually more holistic, that they're for a company that really is meaningful? I'll tell you an interesting story. At TED, we're creating, typically marketing and advertising brands will actually hire the typical advertiser to put on an ad to help market their brand and go forward. Well, TED is doing something very different. We're creating different types of ads, and they're not ads at all. It doesn't talk about their product, doesn't talk about their pricing, doesn't talk about what they're doing, doesn't talk about what's unique. It talks about an idea. And it talks about diversity, or it talks about understanding how to be a true advocate for a global workforce, or it talks about dealing with issues of racism, and how do you accomplish that? And that's what the brand is actually paying for. They're paying for a new type of sponsorship that talks about meaning, nothing to do with their product. That, to me, is a pioneer in figuring out how to redefine what we're doing. So I don't necessarily think it's the legal charters. I think that is part of it, and I think we should adapt it, and I think we should look to change it eventually to address those other components. But I do think one can do quite a lot within the current structure by just doing it and going forward and thinking along those lines, and then, of course, hopefully influencing others in the company that's in fact better for everybody. A happier workforce will make for more profit, I guarantee you, especially looking at employment issues and legal issues. My God, the amount of money that people put out for litigation is extraordinary. But if you do the right thing, and interestingly enough, this is yet another topic I just want to mention, if people are treated with dignity when they're fired, it changes their entire experience. And when you treat someone with dignity as a human being, and you make sure you have respect, and you understand what they're going through, and you have empathy, that goes so far in dealing with them actually leaving a company than if you just say, okay, security force, kick them out. That is going to be much more, developing a case for litigation than anything else. And that's something that's been, statistics-wide, litigation-wide, that is exactly what ends up happening. When you don't treat the person with respect and dignity, that's one of the results. So imagine treating a whole company like that.
I have to end with two questions. I see you and I see the TED behind your head. What does success mean at TED? What is success like at TED?
Yeah, for me, I love being a part of a company that, the mission is to spread ideas worth spreading. to make the world better, to provide a different way of viewing concepts and thoughts, and promoting this idea that one individual, right, can set a transformation. And it's a beautiful method. And I've seen this happen in the 4 years I've been here. It's extraordinary how these pioneers, and they're all pioneers, every single one of them, are trying, thinking, adapting their way of thinking and causing change. So that's been incredibly inspiring to see. And I would say now one of the things that we're working on certainly is just, understanding what diversity and inclusion is from my perspective, really truly expanding that concept and making it real for everybody involved, and just promoting a real inclusive environment, because inclusion is different from diversity, isn't different from having different things. It's all of them have different levels of work and effort involved all the time.
For you, the most important success for Nishat?
I think the coherence between what I do ethically internally, and that's what we've been talking about, is aligned with what I do on a daily basis, right? So I think if that's there, when I come home and talk to my kids about what I do or what different decisions I make, and we talk about different issues around the world, all of that maintains the same music resonance behind it. And that's beautiful. So that's something that I love. And great coffee, please.